Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I work in a secret lab in Antarctica. We found something frozen deep below the ice, and it's starting to move. So, I know this is going to sound like some cheesy horror movie setup, but I swear this is real. This is my life right now. I'm one of the lucky, or maybe unlucky few, who got selected to work in a research lab in Antarctica, of all places. Honestly, when I first got the job, I was over the moon. Who wouldn't be? A fully paid, highly classified research project at the literal bottom of the world. They sold it to me as an opportunity of a lifetime, some once-in-a-generation scientific expedition. I'd always dreamed of going somewhere like this, one of those remote places that most people can't even imagine. But this place is different from any other facility in the world. It's not one of those research stations you see in documentaries. This lab is deep, deep under the ice, more than a mile down. It's cut off from the other stations, away from the world, and we're not exactly broadcasting our location. There are about 15 of us, researchers from all over the world, flown in on private jets and given a crash course on what we'd be working on. But here's the thing, they didn't tell us everything. We got the usual spiel on climate data, studying microbial life, all that usual stuff. But once we were flown down to the actual station, the real work started, and it was not what I expected. We were there to study something hidden in the ice, a massive object, like a structure of some kind, frozen under layers and layers of ice. From what I gathered, they'd found it by accident. Some satellite imagery had detected something anomalous under the ice a few years ago. A few teams came, tried to investigate, but they'd barely scratched the surface, literally. Our job was to drill down and find out what it was. They kept saying it was likely an ancient geological formation, something left over from millions of years ago. But the more we dug, the less that seemed true. Anyway, I've been down here for 6 months now. Life in Antarctica is pretty much exactly what you'd imagine. Cold, dark, and very, very isolated. We live in these tiny sterile rooms, barely bigger than closets, with walls that vibrate every time the generators kick in. We eat pre-packaged meals, wear layers of clothes indoors, and basically live in a bubble. Even the lights are always this sterile, humming blue that makes it hard to tell what time it is. Every day feels the same. The days blur together, and if it wasn't for our schedules, I don't think any of us would know what month it was. Most of my day is spent in the lab, looking at screens and running samples. Our main task is drilling and analysing the ice, measuring carbon levels, studying ancient air pockets, basically anything that can tell us what life was like back when the ice was formed. We even found some bacteria that's been frozen for millennia, but a few weeks ago, things got strange. The drilling team finally hit something solid. I know that doesn't sound creepy on its own, but this is where things get weird. The sonar scans showed something underneath the ice that didn't match anything geological. It's huge, far bigger than anything natural could be, but too regular, too structured. They're not calling it an artifact, officially, yet. But we're all thinking it. We're talking about a structure that's old, I mean really old. The ice that it's encased in dates back hundreds of thousands of years, maybe more. Whatever's down there has been sitting in the dark, frozen, untouched, for longer than modern humanity's been around. So yeah, the drill team was excited. So was I, at first. I mean, who wouldn't be? We're literally uncovering a mystery that's older than human civilization itself. But then, just days after the initial breakthrough, weird stuff started happening. The first thing was the headaches. And these aren't your regular, I've been staring at a screen too long, headaches. These hit hard. a splitting, sharp pain that feels like it's drilling straight into the center of your brain. At first, it was just me, and I didn't think much of it. Stress, lack of sunlight, whatever. But then, everyone else started feeling it too. It's like a pulse, like something is pushing on your skull. The weird part is, the headaches only happen when we're near the drill site. The further you get from that area, the better you feel. It's almost like a warning sign, like something down there doesn't want us getting too close. The second thing was the equipment malfunctions. Our readings started going haywire. Sensors would flip out, cameras would glitch, even the lights would flicker in and out near the drill site. I know, it sounds like typical horror movie stuff, but it's real. I was standing near one of the consoles, monitoring the drill depth, when the whole system just went dead. The screen froze, then started showing static, like some old TV. And in that static, I swear, I could see shapes. Weird, moving shadows, like figures trying to form. But the kicker, the thing that's got me writing this, is what happened yesterday. Our team had finally gotten a camera probe deep enough to get a visual of the object. We'd all gathered around the monitor, holding our breath, waiting to see what was under the ice. The camera feed flickered a bit as it descended, and the ice around it started to clear. And then we saw it. There was something down there, something metallic, almost like an entrance, a door. When the image on the screen finally cleared up, the whole room went silent. We were all just standing there, staring at the monitor like we were hypnotized. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The thing that we saw, it wasn't some natural formation, that's for sure. It was deliberate, man-made. Or maybe not man-made, if you catch my drift. It was a doorway, an actual doorway, like something out of a nightmare. The camera showed this perfectly rectangular shape, outlined against the ice. It wasn't jagged or rough like a natural formation. No, this thing was smooth and sharp, with these strange symbols etched around the edges. Something like glyphs or hieroglyphs, but more twisted. The symbols were familiar but alien at the same time, like they were trying to look like a language we'd understand, but didn't quite hit the mark. I can't even explain why, but just looking at them made my skin crawl. One of the guys, Dr. Allen, tried to break the tension by laughing it off, saying it was probably just some weird rock formation that we were misinterpreting. But you could tell he didn't believe that. None of us did. The drill team had been chipping away for days, and they had never seen anything like this. I could tell from the way they were whispering to each other that they were just as freaked out as I was. But we're scientists, right? Curiosity is in our DNA. We had to know more. So, we decided to get the camera even closer, try to get a view of what was beyond that door. I was half expecting the whole probe to shut down again, given how glitchy the equipment had been lately. But for some reason, it worked fine this time. The feed was steady, almost too steady, like whatever was down there wanted us to keep watching. The camera approached the door, and as it got closer, something really messed up happened. I swear, I felt this heavy pressure in my chest, like someone was squeezing my lungs. A few of the other team members actually backed away from the screen, clutching their chests, gasping like they'd just run a marathon. The air felt thick, and it was hard to breathe, even though we were miles from the actual drill site. It didn't make any sense, but there it was. Something from that feed was pushing against us. And then, the door opened. It happened so slowly that at first I thought it was just another glitch, like the camera was acting up again. But no, it was real. The edges of the door started pulling apart, like something was prying it open from the other side. I couldn't make out what was beyond it. It was just darkness, an inky, bottomless black, that seemed to swallow the light. And then, for the briefest moment, I thought I saw movement, like something shifting in the shadows. We all flinched, instinctively pulling back from the screen, but we couldn't look away. The darkness seemed to stretch and breathe, if that makes any sense. It was alive. And then, the feed cut out. Just like that. 1 second, we were staring into that endless void, and the next, the monitor was dead. Just a blank screen staring back at us. Everyone started talking at once, panicking, trying to figure out what had just happened. The lead scientist, Dr. Ramirez, tried to calm us down, saying that it was just another equipment malfunction, probably caused by the extreme cold. But we all knew better. I mean, it sounds insane, but you could feel something had changed in the room, like the air itself had gotten heavier, charged with something that was beyond our understanding. The thing is, the feed cutting out should have been the end of it. We should have packed up and left the drill site alone. But of course, we didn't. We're scientists. Curiosity isn't just in our DNA. It's practically our job description. So, the next day, Doctor, Ramirez decided to send another probe down, this one equipped with more sensors, infrared, the whole works. She was determined to figure out what was down there, even if it meant digging deeper. I don't know how to explain it, but I had this gut feeling, this primal instinct screaming at me to stay away from the drill site. But nobody listens to their gut when they're dealing with science, right? So I went along with it, pretended like everything was fine, like I wasn't absolutely terrified of what we'd find. We set up the equipment, checked all the readings, and finally, we sent down the second probe. This time, the feed came through crystal clear, no glitches, no static, just a smooth descent down into the ice. As the camera lowered into the shaft, we could see the ice getting darker, denser, almost like it was stained. And then we reached the door again. It was still open, waiting for us. The camera drifted through the opening, and for a second, all we could see was darkness. The infrared picked up faint heat signatures, but they were erratic, like the entire area was pulsing with energy. And then the camera tilted, catching something reflective, something metallic. There was a figure standing in the shadows. I know how that sounds, believe me. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. It was tall, towering, maybe 9 or 10 feet. The thing had this humanoid shape, but it was all wrong, twisted, almost skeletal. Its skin, or whatever was covering it, was this dull, sickly grey, and it was covered in frost, like it had been frozen for centuries. Its head was turned downward, as if it was sleeping. But the weirdest part, it had these elongated, spindly fingers, too many of them, all curled around its body, like it was hugging itself. The thing just stood there, motionless, buried in the shadows. The camera feed started to shake. I'm not talking about a little tremor. I mean, it was shaking like the entire lab was experiencing an earthquake. Monitors flickered, the lights in the room dimmed, and there was this deep, thrumming noise, almost like a heartbeat, resonating through the walls. Everyone in the room went pale. It felt like whatever we were looking at knew we were watching it, and it did not like it. I don't know who said it first, but someone whispered, "We need to turn it off." And for the first time since we got here, I agreed. I wanted nothing more than to shut down that feed and walk away, pretend I'd never seen that thing. But Dr. Ramirez, she was transfixed. She told us to hold on, that this was the discovery of a lifetime. I could see the excitement in her eyes, like she was completely oblivious to the fact that we were staring at something that should not exist. And then it looked up. Those empty, sunken eyes, or the places where eyes should have been, stared directly into the camera, like it could see us. I swear, I felt its gaze lock onto me, even though I was just one person in a room full of terrified scientists. Its mouth was this jagged lipless line that stretched far too wide, like a gash in its face. And as we watched, it started to move. Slowly, almost deliberately, it raised one of those impossibly long arms and pointed at the camera, at us. I could feel this icy dread creeping up my spine. It was like something deep inside me was screaming to run, to get as far away from that monitor as possible. And then, without warning, the probe's temperature gauge spiked. The camera feed went white hot, and we heard a shriek, a bone-chilling, inhuman scream that rattled through the speakers. I swear, it was like the sound itself had weight, pressing down on us, suffocating us. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the feed cut out again. The screen went black, and the room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there trying to process what we'd seen, what we'd heard. Dr. Ramirez looked around the room, and I could see the fear in her eyes too. She tried to put on a brave face, saying that it was just a feedback error, a thermal reaction from the ice. But we all knew the truth. We'd seen something down there, something that had been waiting, something that did not want to be found. That night, I lay in my bunk, staring up at the cold metal ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was in that ice, it was awake now, and it knew we were here. After that night, things weren't the same. I'm not just talking about how people acted. No, it was like the whole station itself had changed. The walls felt tighter, the air colder, and there was this feeling, this pressure, everywhere. It was like something had crawled into the station with us, something that didn't belong in the world we knew. The day after we lost the feed, Dr. Ramirez called for a full equipment review. She said it was precautionary, that we had to check every sensor, every probe, every recording, but anyone could tell she was rattled. I saw her pacing in her office that afternoon, muttering to herself, her hands shaking as she went through the data logs over and over. I even overheard her saying something about how the frequencies didn't match. Whatever that meant, it was clear she'd seen something in the data that didn't add up, something she didn't want the rest of us to know. We were all put on rotating night shifts to monitor the drill site. Dr. Ramirez didn't explain why, just said it was protocol. I got assigned the first night. Usually the night shifts in Antarctica are uneventful, just hours of sitting around, watching the screens, trying not to fall asleep. But I knew this shift would be different. I could feel it the second I sat down in front of the monitors. The room was so quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you hear your own heartbeat. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, that I'd let the strange feed and the weird readings mess with my head. But then, as I watched the monitors, I felt that familiar pressure building in my chest again. It was like an invisible weight, pressing down on me harder and harder, like something was slowly pushing the air out of the room. I'd been in confined spaces before, but this was different. It felt personal. Around 2 a.m., just when I was starting to convince myself I'd imagined it, the lights flickered. Not the usual power blip. We get those sometimes in the stormy season. This was different. The lights dimmed down to this sickly, greenish glow, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls. I could see my own shadow stretched out, distorted, almost like it was reaching for something I couldn't see. And then I heard it, the hum. It was low, barely audible at first, like the faint buzz of machinery. But it grew louder, more insistent, filling the room until it felt like the walls were vibrating with it. I looked at the monitors, hoping for some clue, but they showed nothing. Just static, shifting and flickering in patterns that almost seemed intentional, like something was moving, behind the screen. For a split second, I thought I saw those strange symbols again, flashing in the static like some distorted warning. But then they were gone. I was about to call Dr. Ramirez when the temperature sensor started going haywire. The numbers on the screen plummeted, dropping faster and faster until they hit below what the system was calibrated to read. Negative numbers flashed in red across the screen, blinking urgently. I checked the internal temperature gauge on my desk, and it read fine, normal. But the feed from the drill site, that was something else. Whatever was down there, the temperature was dropping to levels that should have been impossible. And then I saw movement. It was faint at first, just a flicker in the corner of the monitor that showed the corridor outside the drill chamber. But it wasn't one of us. It was too tall, too thin, like a shadow that had stretched itself too far. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But it stayed, moving slowly, almost gliding down the corridor. My hands started to shake, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that screen as possible. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The thing, the shadow, drifted closer to the door leading into the main lab, and I swear, I felt it watching me, even through the monitor. I don't know how to explain it, but there was this awareness, like it was sizing me up, studying me. I wanted to reach for the radio, to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't move. I was completely frozen, just watching this thing slide closer, inch by inch. And then it stopped. The shadow just stood there, still as a statue, right at the door to the lab. I don't know how long it stayed like that. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt strange, stretched out, like it was being pulled apart. And then, slowly, its head, or whatever it had in place of a head, turned toward the camera. I could feel it looking through the screen, staring straight at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I swear, for a second, I thought it smiled. And then it vanished. Just like that, the shadow was gone, and the lights flickered back to normal. The temperature reading stabilized, and the hum faded away, leaving me alone in the silence. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, maybe some glitch in the system. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't alone down there. None of us were. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran back to my quarters, hoping I could just shut the door and lock myself away from whatever had been lurking out there. But the second I stepped into my room, I froze. There, on the floor, right by my bunk, was a footprint. It wasn't a regular footprint. No, this was elongated, stretched, almost clawed, and it was covered in frost. There was no way it could have gotten there. I hadn't let anyone in my room, and I hadn't tracked any snow or ice in with me. It was like that thing had visited. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow, staring at me from the other side of the door. The way it had moved, the way it had looked straight through the camera, like it knew exactly who I was. It was like it had chosen me. I lay in bed, listening to every creak, every distant hum of the machinery, half convinced I'd see that shadow slip under my door and come for me. The next morning, I tried to talk to a few of the others, see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. At first, people brushed me off, chalking it up to exhaustion or isolation getting to me. But as I kept talking, I saw the fear in their eyes. They'd felt it too. They'd seen something. One of the engineers, a guy named Alexei, pulled me aside later and told me he'd seen the same shadow on his night shift 2 days earlier. He'd thought he was hallucinating, But when I described what I saw, he went pale. I heard it breathing, he whispered, his voice shaking. When I was alone in the corridor, I heard it behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing, just frost. We tried to tell Dr. Ramirez, but she brushed it off, saying it was all in our heads, that the darkness and isolation were playing tricks on us. But I could see it in her face. She didn't believe that. Not really. She just didn't want to admit it. Over the next few days, the incidents kept getting worse. Equipment would shut down randomly. Temperature readings would spike or plummet without explanation. And that hum, that awful hum, would fill the hallways, like something was stirring beneath us. And every night, I'd find that same icy footprint near my bunk, as if it was a reminder that the thing down there, it wasn't done with me yet. By the end of the week, people were barely holding it together. Everyone was tense, jumpy, flinching at every little sound. I even caught one of the researchers, Doctor Khan, whispering to herself in her room, her hands clutching her temples like she was in pain. She looked at me with these haunted eyes and whispered, "They're coming. They're coming up from the dark." And then she shut her door in my face. Finally, Dr. Ramirez called an emergency meeting. She said it was just to reassure everyone that we were safe, that the readings were normal. But halfway through her speech, the lights went out. Not just a flicker this time, complete, suffocating darkness. Everyone went dead silent. And in that moment, I swear, I could feel it. That thing, that shadow, was right there in the room with us, hiding in the darkness, waiting. I heard someone gasp, and in the pitch black, I could feel a presence, something cold and ancient brushing past me, just inches away. And then I heard the whisper, a voice so faint, it was barely there, but somehow I knew it was speaking directly to me. It's not the cold you should fear, it's the dark. And just like that, the lights came back on. Dr. Ramirez was standing there, pale and shaken, but trying to keep her composure. She told us the meeting was over and to go back to our stations, but I could see it in everyone's eyes. We weren't safe here, not anymore. The thing in the ice was awake, and it was coming for us. And for some reason, I could feel it in my bones. It was only just beginning. After that night, any pretense of normalcy was gone. Everyone was on edge, whispering in the hallways, casting nervous glances at every shadow, every flickering light. I don't think any of us slept. Whatever it wasn't staying in the drill site anymore. It was slipping through the station, creeping into our rooms, our minds. The weird part was, nobody wanted to leave. You'd think after all the strange sightings, the whispers, the icy footprints, we'd all be scrambling to evacuate. But it was like we were anchored to this place. Dr. Ramirez called it scientific duty, that we couldn't abandon the project after coming so far. But I could tell it was more than that. Something kept us here, something intangible. It was like the very walls of the station were urging us to stay, whispering to us in that same low hum that haunted the drill site. Then, one day, Dr. Ramirez made the decision that changed everything. She announced that we'd be sending a team down the drill shaft. "We need answers," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "We've come this far, and it's our responsibility to see this through." Nobody volunteered. I mean, who would? But in the end, it didn't matter. Dr. Ramirez chose 2 people, Alexei and me. We were to suit up, descend into the icy tunnel, and enter whatever lay beyond that door. She handed us flashlights, extra oxygen tanks, and a high-frequency radio to stay in contact. Her face was pale as she briefed us, but her hands were steady, and she kept insisting it was perfectly safe. "Nothing to be afraid of," she said, her voice unconvincing. I could feel her lie hanging in the air like frost. Alexei and I suited up in heavy, insulated gear, the kind designed to withstand the most brutal conditions on Earth. But even with all the layers, I could still feel a chill creeping under my skin, deeper than anything I'd felt before. This was a different kind of cold, one that reached into your bones and refused to let go. As we stepped into the drill shaft, the others gathered around, their faces a mix of relief and pity. It was like they were seeing us off to some final one-way journey. The descent into the ice was slow, painfully slow. The tunnel was just wide enough to fit our bodies, and as we lowered ourselves deeper, I could feel the walls pressing in on me, like the ice was alive, squeezing tighter with every foot we dropped. The light from above faded, and soon we were swallowed by the kind of darkness that felt alive, as if it were watching us. We kept the radio line open, but all we could hear was static, broken occasionally by Dr. Ramirez's voice, crackling through, distorted by the thick ice between us. "Proceed with caution," she kept saying. "Report any findings immediately." But her voice was distant, hollow, like she was already miles away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the bottom. The drill had left a jagged opening in the ice, leading into a dark, cavernous space. Alexei and I switched on our flashlights, casting narrow beams across the frozen walls. The light barely pierced the darkness. It just created these long, sharp shadows that danced and shifted as we moved. I could feel the cold pressing in on me, seeping into my lungs with every breath, almost like the air itself was filled with shards of ice. Ahead of us was the door. It looked even worse in person. The symbols carved into the edges seemed to writhe under our flashlights, shifting and changing as if they were alive. They weren't just markings, they were messages, though none of us could read them. Alexei and I exchanged a glance, both of us hesitating. But there was no going back now. We approached the door, stepping carefully, our boots crunching on the frosted ground. And then, I don't know why, but I reached out and touched it. The second my fingers brushed the cold surface, I felt a jolt, like an electric shock, shooting through my entire body. I saw images, flashes of things that didn't make sense, things that I couldn't explain. I saw barren landscapes, endless ice stretching out under a black sky, and strange figures moving across the horizon. But the worst part was, I felt something looking back at me, something ancient, powerful, and very, very aware. I stumbled back, gasping, my fingers numb and trembling. Alexei looked at me, eyes wide, but before he could say anything, the door, it started to open. The grinding noise was deep, rumbling through the ice, as if the very glacier was groaning in protest. The door pulled apart, revealing a yawning blackness beyond, darker than anything I'd ever seen. It was like looking into a void, an emptiness so complete it seemed to swallow all light, all warmth. I could feel a slight pull, like the darkness was trying to reach out, drawing us in. Alexei muttered something in Russian, his voice shaky, and he took a step back, but I felt rooted in place, frozen by a mixture of fear and awe. I could sense something moving within that darkness, a presence that was vast and incomprehensible, something that had been waiting, watching, for centuries, maybe longer. The air around us grew colder, and I could see our breath hanging in the air, crystallizing before it even left our mouths. And then we heard it. A voice, low, guttural and impossible, like the creaking of ice shifting beneath unimaginable weight. It wasn't speaking a language I could understand, but I knew it was speaking to us, to me. The words vibrated through my skull, twisting in ways that hurt to comprehend, like they were shaping thoughts I wasn't meant to have. I grabbed Alexei's arm, trying to pull him back, but he was staring straight into the void, his eyes wide, almost vacant. His mouth moved like he was mumbling, repeating something under his breath. I leaned in to hear him, and what he was saying sent a chill down my spine. They are cold. They are old. They are watching. I shook him, snapping him out of it, and we backed away from the doorway. But just as we turned, I felt a hand, or something like a hand, grasp my shoulder. I froze, too scared to turn around, too terrified to see what had reached out from the darkness. The grip was icy, piercing through my suit, my skin, straight into the bone. It was like being touched by death itself. I felt my heart racing, pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then the grip released, and I stumbled forward, almost falling. Alexei grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the tunnel. "We need to go," he whispered, his voice barely audible, almost pleading. I didn't argue. We turned and ran, stumbling over the uneven ice, our flashlights bouncing, casting twisted shadows that seemed to follow us, like they were chasing us out of that cursed place. As we climbed up the tunnel, the hum returned, louder and more menacing than ever, vibrating through the ice around us, making the walls shudder. I could feel it building, like it was gaining strength, echoing up from the darkness below. And then, just as we reached the entrance, I heard it again, a whisper, soft and taunting, that echoed through the ice. "You opened the door, and now we come." We stumbled into the main station, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking with cold and fear. The others looked at us, their faces pale, eyes wide. They could see the terror in our faces, feel the cold radiating off us. Dr. Ramirez rushed over, demanding to know what we'd found, but neither of us could speak. We just stood there, silent, shivering, knowing that whatever lay beneath the ice was awake now, and it was coming. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to process what we'd seen, what I'd felt. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that endless darkness, felt that icy grip on my shoulder. And in the silence, I could hear the hum, faint but growing stronger, echoing up from the depths below. I didn't sleep at all. None of us did. The next morning, we found Alexei's bed, empty. His belongings were still there, his boots by the door, his coat on the hook. But he was gone. We searched every inch of the station, every hallway, every room. But there was no sign of him. It was like he'd simply vanished. And when we checked the security footage, we saw him, walking slowly down the hall toward the drill shaft. Alone, without a suit, without a flashlight. The last frame showed him disappearing into the darkness, into the ice. And the worst part? He was smiling. After Alexei disappeared, the whole station went into a kind of numb silence. We stopped talking to each other, stopped trying to pretend everything was normal. Instead, we all carried this quiet, unspoken fear, as if even mentioning Alexei would somehow invite whatever was down there to come closer. Dr. Ramirez ordered us to seal the drill shaft. She said it was for safety protocols, that we'd collected all the data we needed, that it was time to focus on analysing what we'd found. But we all knew the truth. She was terrified. That iron control she always had was cracking. I'd catch her pacing the halls at night, muttering to herself, her face pale and hollowed out by exhaustion. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew she'd let something loose, something we couldn't put back. 2 nights later, the radio came alive. It was around 3 a.m, and I was on night watch. The halls were quiet, the whole station blanketed in that oppressive, waiting silence. I was half dozing at my post when the radio crackled. Faint at first, just static and whispers, like background noise. But then, Clear as day, I heard a voice. It was Alexei. My heart practically stopped. I leaned in, my hand shaking as I turned up the volume. His voice came through in fragments, broken and distorted, like it was being broadcast from somewhere deep underground. They're beautiful, so cold, so old. I felt this creeping dread slither up my spine. I tried to respond, to ask him where he was, how he was transmitting, but he didn't answer, just kept talking in that eerie, breathless whisper, like he was describing something he'd found, something he was in awe of. They wait in the dark. They're calling us. It's so beautiful here. Then, a burst of static cut him off, and the line went dead. I sat there, my heart hammering, staring at the radio, willing it to come back on. But there was only silence. A silence that pressed down on me, colder and heavier than anything I'd felt before. The next morning, I told Dr. Ramirez about the transmission. She just stared at me, her face drained of all colour. She looked older, tired, like she'd aged a decade overnight. I could see her hands shaking as she poured herself a cup of coffee, spilling half of it on the table. "We have to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to get out of here." But she just shook her head. "There's no way out until the supply team arrives," she said, her voice flat and empty. "We have 2 more weeks here." 2 weeks. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I don't think any of us believed we'd make it that long. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, listening to every creak, every whisper of the wind outside. And then, around midnight, I heard it. The hum. That same low, thrumming vibration, but louder now, filling the entire station, pulsing through the walls. It was coming from the drill shaft. I could tell, echoing up from the depths. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. I could feel it, vibrating through my bones, crawling into my mind. Then I heard footsteps outside my door, slow, shuffling footsteps, like someone was dragging their feet. They stopped right outside my room. I lay there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. And then, just as I thought it was over, I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Come, see." My heart nearly stopped. The voice was familiar. It was Alexei. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed, trapped in my bed, as the footsteps continued down the hall, fading into the distance. I knew where they were headed, the drill shaft. The next morning, I found Dr. Khan and a few others by the entrance to the drill shaft. They were pale, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow. None of us spoke as we looked at each other, a silent agreement passing between us. We had to see what was down there. We had to know. Dr. Ramirez tried to stop us, tried to order us back, but her words had no weight anymore. She looked as broken as the rest of us, just a shell of the confident leader she'd once been. In the end, she didn't follow us. She just stood there, watching as we suited up and prepared for the descent. The 5 of us entered the shaft, the air thick with dread, each of us holding our breath as we descended. The tunnel seemed longer this time, colder. The walls pressed in tighter, and the hum grew louder, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo in our bones. We reached the bottom and stepped into the cavern, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The door was still open, waiting for us like a gaping wound in the ice. I could feel that presence, that awareness, pulsing from within, watching us, beckoning us forward. As we moved toward the door, something flickered in the darkness. I squinted, trying to make it out, and then I realized it was Alexei, He was standing there, just inside the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was smiling. "Alexei," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond, just stood there, staring at us with that empty, hollow smile. I could see frost clinging to his skin, his clothes, like he'd been down here for years. And then, slowly, he raised a hand, beckoning us forward. "Come. See." The others hesitated, but something compelled me to step closer. It was like I was being pulled, like some invisible force was dragging me toward the doorway. I couldn't resist it. I didn't want to resist it. The hum grew louder, filling my head, drowning out all other thoughts. I could feel it vibrating in my skull, pounding in rhythm with my heartbeat. As I stepped through the doorway, the darkness swallowed me whole. The air was different on the other side, thicker, colder, filled with a strange metallic taste that clung to my tongue. My flashlight barely worked, the beam flickering, but I could make out shapes, figures moving in the shadows. They were tall, impossibly thin, their bodies twisted, elongated, like they were made of shadow and frost. They drifted around me, their heads tilted, their eyes hollow and empty, yet somehow aware. I heard whispers, faint and distant, echoing through the darkness. They weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them all the same. They were calling to me, beckoning, inviting me deeper. And then I saw it. In the center of the chamber, surrounded by the shifting shadows, was a figure. It was massive, towering over everything else, its form barely visible in the dim light. Its body was covered in frost, its limbs elongated and twisted, and its eyes were black, endless pits that seemed to draw in all the light, all the warmth. I couldn't look away. Those eyes held me, pulling me in, and in that moment, I understood. This thing, this presence, it was ancient, older than anything I could comprehend. It had been here long before us, buried in the ice, waiting for us to find it. It raised one of its arms, extending a long skeletal finger pointing at me. I could feel its thoughts pressing into my mind, filling me with images, memories that weren't mine. I saw frozen landscapes, barren and lifeless, stretching out under a dark sky. I saw civilizations rise and fall, watched as they were swallowed by ice and time. And through it all, I felt its hunger, a cold, endless hunger that had waited in silence for millennia. It wanted us, not just our bodies, but our minds, our memories. It wanted to consume everything we were, everything we had ever been. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping it. I tried to scream, tried to turn and run, but I was frozen, trapped in that dark gaze. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw the others, the rest of my team. They were standing there, motionless, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They had been taken, consumed, hollowed out by whatever this thing was. And then, slowly, one by one, they turned to look at me, their faces twisted into the same vacant, frozen smile. The last thing I remember is the darkness closing in, swallowing me whole, as the hum grew louder and louder, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. The supply team found us 2 weeks later when they came to resupply the station. The entire facility was empty, silent, covered in a thin layer of frost. They found my journal, left open on the table, the last entry scrawled in shaky handwriting. They wait in the dark. They are cold. They are old. And now they are free. None of us were ever found. The station was abandoned, sealed off, classified as a hazardous site. No one's allowed to go back down there now. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, people say they hear a hum, echoing up from the depths, pulsing through the ice. And they say, if you listen closely, you can still hear us whispering, calling, inviting you to come see. I'm a cleaner for high-profile clients. Last night, I had to scrub blood off the walls of an underground government facility. I guess you could say I'm a professional cleaner. No, not like a maid or janitor. What I do is a little different. It's not something I talk about openly, even here. Let's just say that if you have something you need to disappear, evidence, traces, stains that bleach and elbow grease can't handle, my phone is the one that rings. I work for high-profile clients. You'd be surprised how much blood, dirt, and whatever else powerful people leave behind. The money is good, really good. But the job, well, it's a hell of a lot darker than most people could handle. I've scrubbed everything from millionaire mansions to grungy basements belonging to friends of my employers. I'm pretty much unfazed by what I see now. I've trained myself to be numb to it, or so I thought. Last night changed everything. I'd just gotten back from a standard call, a clean-up job for a CEO who'd gotten into a scuffle that he didn't want the authorities to know about. I was actually looking forward to a night off. My hands were still sore from scrubbing, and my mind was hazy from the fumes of industrial-grade cleaners. So, when my phone rang at around 11 p.m, I almost didn't answer. But then, I saw who it was. John, my boss. And let me just say, if John calls you, it's serious. He's not the kind of guy who just checks in or calls to shoot the breeze. When I picked up, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Pack your gear, this one's urgent," he said, his voice clipped and mechanical. "Tonight?" I asked, genuinely thrown off. Usually, I get a little more notice. Tonight, and bring everything. Now, everything is code for we're expecting a mess. Blood, chemicals, stains that burn through layers of flooring. Whatever it is, I needed to be prepared. I couldn't help but feel that twisting sensation in my gut, that quiet, nagging fear I'd taught myself to ignore. But something in John's voice made it louder. I wasn't even sure why. The guy's monotone by now is like white noise to me. But this time, there was something underneath it. "Where am I headed?" I asked, shoving bottles of cleaning agents, gloves, masks, and a few tools I don't think even have names into my duffel bag. He paused. "North End," he finally said, then hesitated again. "I'll send you an address. You'll get clearance instructions on site." This was weird for two reasons. One, I've never cleaned anything in the North End before. That's government territory, labs, bunkers, places that people don't even know exist. Two, he said clearance instructions. Normally, I just show up, flash my ID if needed, and go to work. But I figured I'd ask questions later, or not ask at all. Really, because in my line of work, curiosity is a killer. I threw on my coat, checked my supplies again, and headed out. The streets were quiet, eerily quiet. There wasn't even the usual late-night buzz of drunks stumbling home, or sketchy people lingering in shadows. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I drove. And then my phone pinged. It was the address. 6423 North Beechwood Avenue. I frowned. Beechwood didn't even sound like a real place, and I'd never seen it on any map. My GPS didn't recognize it either, so I had to rely on the directions in John's text. And as I got closer, my headlights barely cut through the pitch black of the winding roads. There weren't any streetlights, and the whole area seemed like it had been deserted for decades. At one point, I was pretty sure I saw an old, rotting, dead-end sign. Finally, I reached a large gate. There was no sign, no building, just a thick metal gate with a tiny black intercom on the side. I had to press the button and wait, feeling like an intruder in some twisted government facility from a movie. The intercom crackled to life, and a robotic voice barked out, "State your name and purpose." I cleared my throat. I'm here for the cleanup," I replied, my voice sounding small and uncertain. I hated that. I'm not usually one to get shaken up. The gate groaned open, and I drove down a gravel path that wound around the trees, descending into what looked like an underground bunker carved into a hillside. No windows, no markings, just cold, grey concrete that seemed to swallow the light from my headlights. There was a single guard waiting for me at the entrance, wearing one of those expressionless masks. He held out a clipboard with a contract for me to sign. It was standard procedure. Every job requires a non-disclosure form. But this one was different. Instead of the usual single-page sheet, this one was thick. Pages of clauses, written in dense legalese that I didn't have time to read, especially not in the frigid night air. "Sign it," the guard said, his voice flat and uninterested. I signed without reading. I don't ask questions, remember? Not if I want to keep my job. Once I signed, the guard gave me a nod and handed me a set of keys. Then he turned and walked off, disappearing into the night as if he'd never been there. I was alone in front of the door, clutching the keys, the cold metal biting into my palm. My instructions were to go down 2 levels, through a series of hallways, and meet my contact at the end. I wasn't used to being given instructions to this level of detail, and that only made the unease creep up my spine. Something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut. But I'd come too far to back out now. As I walked down the dimly lit corridor, each step echoed, bouncing off the concrete walls and disappearing into the shadows. There were cameras everywhere, red lights blinking in rhythm, almost like they were alive, watching my every move. The walls were bare, a dull grey, with no signs, no indication of what this place was. Then I turned a corner, and there it was. Blood, everywhere. Thick smears of it on the walls, splatters on the floor, like something explosive had happened. It wasn't a small spill, or even a large one. This was carnage, like someone had just ripped through a dozen people right where I was standing. I froze, the cold seeping into my bones. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A faint, low hum, like machinery, or breathing. At that moment, my phone buzzed, snapping me out of my trance. It was John. "You're at the right spot, get to work, and whatever you do, don't look behind you." I stood there, staring at the blood on the walls. I felt like I was suffocating, and not just from the smell. Blood has this metallic stench that sticks to the back of your throat, makes it hard to swallow. But this was more than that. It was almost like the whole place was breathing, like the walls themselves were watching me. John's last words hung in my mind. "Don't look behind you." I couldn't shake it. It was the kind of phrase that sticks in your brain, twisting and scratching, daring you to disobey. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming to turn around. But I didn't. I'd learned one thing in this job. If John says something, he means it. So I took a breath, forced my focus forward, and started setting up my gear. I took out a bottle of bleach, a bristled scrub brush, and my mask. With my gloved hands, I poured the bleach onto the nearest splatter. The chemical smell hit me hard, mingling with the metallic tang in the air. I started scrubbing, the brush grinding against the concrete. But the blood wasn't coming up easily. It was smeared too thick, almost sticky. As I worked, I noticed something odd. I'd seen blood in every form you can imagine. Fresh, dry, spattered, pooled, you name it. But this blood was different. It was dark, almost black, and as I scrubbed, it seemed to spread, not fade. It seeped into the grooves of the concrete, as if the walls were drinking it in. My hands shook, the brush slipping. I was usually meticulous about cleaning, never letting my nerves get the better of me. But there was something wrong here. I could feel it. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. The wall where I'd been scrubbing, where the blood had been, was now clean, spotless. But the blood, it wasn't gone. It had shifted, almost like it was creeping along the wall, moving slowly, forming patterns that made my head throb if I looked too closely. I felt an urge to blink, to shake off whatever this illusion was, but something deep inside told me I wasn't seeing things. The blood was moving. I backed away, the brush still in my hand. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from John. No matter what you see, finish the job. He must have known what I was looking at. That message wasn't just instructions. It was a warning. I felt a flash of anger. If he knew what kind of place this was, what was happening here, why the hell hadn't he told me? I almost wanted to throw my phone, to call him and demand an explanation. But then I heard it. A low scraping sound, like metal against concrete. It was coming from further down the corridor. Every instinct in my body was screaming to run. But running wasn't part of the job. Not if I wanted to keep it anyway. So I took a breath, forcing myself to move toward the sound, leaving my cleaning supplies behind for the moment. The air grew colder the further I went, until I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. There was a door, just slightly ajar, with a dim red light flickering above it. The light was broken, blinking in and out, like something out of a horror movie. The door looked like it had been forced open. Deep scratches marred the metal surface, and it hung crooked on its hinges. Inside the room was a mess. Tables overturned, chairs splintered, papers scattered everywhere. And in the center of it all was a single, broken surgical table, the kind you'd find in an operating room. The straps were torn, and there were deep, jagged scratches all over the surface, as if someone, or something, had been fighting to get free. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I couldn't look away. This wasn't just some lab or government office. This was something else. I didn't know exactly what they did here. But whatever it was bad. Really bad. The walls in this room were smeared with handprints, bloody, desperate handprints that trailed toward the door. I stared at them, frozen, trying to imagine the kind of horror that would leave someone clawing to escape. And then I saw it. A symbol scratched into the wall above the table, carved in thick, deep lines. It looked like a triangle with a circle inside and lines radiating from the center. I'd never seen it before, but just looking at it made me feel sick, like something ancient and rotten was squirming inside my head. That's when I heard footsteps. Heavy, slow, dragging footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, heart racing, but I couldn't see anyone. The corridor was empty, except for that damn blood that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, following me like a shadow. My phone buzzed again, the sound making me jump. Room 3, clean it! I clenched my teeth. I wanted to shout, to ask what the hell was going on, why there was blood that moved, why there were symbols on the walls. But I didn't. I just gripped my brush tighter, swallowed back the bile in my throat, and turned to find room 3. Room 3 was down another hallway, past a series of doors that looked like they'd been abandoned for years. The smell was stronger here, something between bleach, rot, and iron. As I neared the room, I noticed the door was open, just a crack, enough for me to see that the lights inside were flickering. Pushing the door open, I felt a rush of stale, freezing air hit me. Inside, the walls were covered in more symbols, like the one in the first room, but these were fresher. The lines were jagged, like they'd been scraped with bare hands, and there were chunks of dried skin stuck in some of the grooves. The air was thick with a damp, rotting smell that clung to the back of my throat, making it hard to breathe. In the centre of the room was a drain, large and rusted, the kind you see in horror movies where something nasty is about to crawl out. And from that drain, I could hear a faint sound, like whispers. They were soft, barely audible, but they were there, rising and falling, like the murmur of a crowd, speaking words I couldn't understand. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the task at hand. I grabbed my mop and started scrubbing around the drain, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the way the symbols seemed to shift every time I looked away. But then, something splashed up from the drain. I jumped back as thick, dark liquid bubbled up, spilling over the edges. It looked like blood, but darker, thicker, and as it spread across the floor, it began to move, creeping toward me, pooling around my feet. I stumbled back, trying not to panic, but the more I backed up, the more it followed. I grabbed my phone, ready to call John and tell him I was done, that whatever this was, it was beyond me. But before I could dial, I got another message. Don't leave. Room 3 isn't finished. The words made my blood run cold. How did he know? How did he know I was about to run? I looked up, feeling that familiar heavy presence behind me. This time, I couldn't resist. I turned around. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. Tall, thin, with limbs that seemed just a little too long, a face half covered in shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see its eyes. They were dark, empty holes, staring straight at me, watching. I felt paralyzed, like every muscle in my body was locked in place. And then it stepped forward. I wanted to scream, to back away, but I couldn't move. It reached out one skeletal hand, pointing at the drain, at the blood pooling on the floor. I didn't understand what it wanted, but I felt compelled, as if it was controlling me, guiding my hand as I went back to scrubbing, even as the blood continued to rise, even as the whispers grew louder, filling my head with sounds that felt like they were tearing through my skull. I don't know how long I scrubbed, how long I was trapped in that room, with the whispers and the symbols, and the thing watching me, pushing me to finish. But eventually, the drain started to clear, the blood receding, the whispers fading. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I staggered out of the room, my clothes soaked, my hands stained dark red, my mind numb with terror. As I stumbled back down the hallway, past the empty rooms and the flickering lights, I got one last text from John. Good job. Now leave, and don't talk about this. I didn't need to be told twice. I practically ran out of there, out into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I don't know what that place was, or what I'd just cleaned up. I don't want to know. But as I drove home, my hands still shaking, I noticed something on my wrist. A faint red mark, like a symbol, burned into my skin. It was the same symbol I'd seen on the walls. I spent the drive home in a fog, hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind kept replaying the image of that thing in the doorway, those hollow eyes drilling into me. I knew the eyes would be haunting my nightmares for weeks, if I even managed to get any sleep at all. When I finally pulled up outside my apartment, everything felt wrong. The building looked different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I felt like someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows as I fumbled with my keys. But every time I looked around, the street was empty. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it clung to my skin like that place had followed me home. Inside, I went straight to the bathroom. I was desperate to wash the blood off my hands, to scrub away the grime and stench that clung to me like a second skin. I turned on the faucet and shoved my hands under the water, scrubbing so hard it hurt. But no matter how much soap I used, no matter how raw my skin got, I couldn't shake the feeling that the blood was still there, soaked into my flesh. Then I looked up and caught my reflection in the mirror. That's when I saw it. On my wrist, just below where my sleeve ended, was the faint outline of a mark. It was the same symbol I'd seen scratched into the walls, the same symbol that had made my skin crawl. A triangle with a circle in the center, lines radiating outward, like some kind of ancient seal. I rubbed at it hard, hoping it was just an imprint from the job, some leftover grime from that blood. But it didn't fade. In fact, the harder I scrubbed, the clearer it got, as if it were being carved deeper into my skin with each movement. Panic flared in my chest, my heart racing as I tried everything I could think of to remove it. I scrubbed with soap, then bleach, then alcohol, my skin raw and burning. But it stayed there, an eerie reminder of whatever had happened in that place. Every time I looked at it, I felt like I could almost hear those whispers again, faint and distant, echoing in the back of my mind. I backed out of the bathroom, too shaken to even look at myself, and went to sit on the edge of my bed, head in my hands. I kept telling myself it was just exhaustion. I'd been up for hours, scrubbing blood off walls in a bunker filled with God knows what. I just needed to sleep, that's all. I'd wake up in the morning and this mark would be gone, and everything would be fine. But even as I thought that, I knew I was lying to myself. Nothing about this was normal. I'd worked the darkest, grimiest jobs that would make anyone else lose their lunch. But this was different. I could feel it, deep in my gut. I'd seen something tonight that I wasn't supposed to see, and now it was following me. I grabbed my phone, hands still shaking, and dialed John's number. It rang and rang, each second stretching out like an eternity, until it finally went to voicemail. I hung up, tried again. Same thing. I left a short message, my voice cracking slightly as I asked him to call me back as soon as he got the message. I wasn't about to tell him what I'd seen on a voicemail, but I needed answers, now more than ever. I lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing mind. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that blood creeping across the floor, those desperate handprints smeared along the walls, that figure with the empty eyes watching me. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a noise, a faint tapping sound, coming from somewhere in my apartment. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound continued, steady and deliberate, like fingers tapping against glass. It was coming from the bathroom. I stood there, frozen, the air thick and silent around me. My bedroom was pitch black, but I could see a faint glow spilling out from the bathroom doorway. I hadn't left any lights on. My stomach turned as I realized it was the same sickly red light I'd seen in the bunker, flickering and weak, like it was struggling to stay alive. I forced myself to get up, my legs shaky as I crept toward the bathroom. The tapping continued, louder now, almost insistent, like something was trying to get my attention. I reached the doorway and peered inside. There, in the bathroom mirror, was the symbol. The triangle with the circle, the lines radiating outward. It had been drawn on the glass in thick, dark streaks, like someone had smeared it there with blood. And in the center, almost hidden in the shadows, was a face. My face. But it wasn't me. The eyes staring back were hollow, black pits, just like the thing I'd seen in the bunker, my reflection twisted and contorted, the mouth stretching open in a silent scream, the symbol on my wrist glowing a faint, pulsing red. I stumbled back, almost tripping over myself as I backed out of the bathroom, heart hammering in my chest. I knew I should leave, get as far away from this place as possible. But where would I go? I didn't even understand what was happening, let alone how to stop it. And deep down, I had this horrible feeling that it wouldn't matter where I went. Whatever was haunting me, it would follow. I collapsed onto my couch, my mind racing, every thought tangled and frantic. I kept glancing at my phone, hoping, praying that John would call back, that he'd give me some kind of explanation. But the screen stayed dark, mocking me with its silence. Then, just as I was starting to think about calling him again, my phone buzzed. I scrambled to grab it, almost dropping it in my haste. But when I looked at the screen, my heart sank. It wasn't John. It was an unknown number. I stared at it, dread coiling in my stomach, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I took a deep breath and answered, "Hello." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a low, distorted voice crackled through the line. "You shouldn't have looked." The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, to demand who they were, what they wanted, but I couldn't get the words out. My throat was dry, my voice caught in my chest. "You took something that wasn't yours," the voice continued, its tone cold, mechanical, like it wasn't coming from a human being. "And now it belongs to you." What are you talking about?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. There was a pause, and then the line went dead. I stared at my phone, the blood pounding in my ears. I wanted to throw it, smash it to pieces, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. The words echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. "You took something that wasn't yours, and now it belongs to you." I glanced down at the symbol on my wrist, the lines dark and angry against my skin. I didn't know what it meant, but I had the sickening feeling that it was only the beginning. That whatever I'd seen, whatever I'd touched in that place, was now a part of me, like a scar that would never heal. The tapping started again. This time, it was coming from the front door. The tapping at the door was steady and patient, like whoever or whatever was on the other side had all the time in the world. I sat frozen on the couch, every muscle in my body tense, my mind a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. My instincts screamed at me not to open it, but the tapping continued, each knock hammering deeper into my nerves. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone, hoping to find a missed call from John, some text, any sign that he could explain what was happening. But my screen was blank, save for the faint reflection of my own panicked face. The tapping grew louder, sharper, each knock reverberating through my apartment, refusing to be ignored. Finally, I stood up. My legs felt like lead, every step toward the door slow and reluctant. I gripped the doorknob, took a breath, and swung it open. There was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out in either direction, quiet and still. I stepped out, peering down the corridor, half expecting to see some figure lurking in the shadows. But it was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting a sickly, yellowish glow. I was about to retreat back into my apartment, to lock the door and pretend none of this was happening, when I noticed something on the floor, right outside my door. A single, blood-red envelope. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, the paper cold and damp, like it had been sitting out in the rain, even though the hallway was dry. There was no name, no address, nothing to suggest where it had come from or who had left it. But it felt heavy, weighted with a presence I couldn't ignore. My fingers trembled as I slid it open. Inside was a single slip of paper, blank except for a series of numbers scrawled across the centre in dark, jagged handwriting. 6,423. It was the address from last night, the facility I'd been called to, the place that had left its mark on me, literally and figuratively. I stared at the numbers, a cold chill settling over me. I knew what it meant, what it was telling me to do. I didn't want to go back there. The thought alone made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore it. It was like the symbol on my wrist was burning, urging me forward, calling me back to where this nightmare had started. Against every instinct in my body, I grabbed my coat and keys, shoving the paper back into the envelope and pocketing it. I left my apartment, locking the door behind me, even though I knew it was a pointless gesture. Whatever had latched onto me, it didn't need doors to get in. The drive felt like it took hours, every street dark and desolate. The usual glow of city lights dimmer than usual, as if the world itself was pulling back, trying to distance itself from whatever I was about to face. The roads twisted in strange ways, and at one point I was sure I'd taken a wrong turn, but somehow I ended up on that same gravel path leading to the facility. The gate was wide open this time, no intercom, no guard, just an open invitation into the darkness. I parked my car, stepping out into the frigid night air. The place looked exactly the same, though now, in the silence of the night, it seemed even more ominous. The building loomed ahead, grey and unmarked, the same flickering red light casting an eerie glow over the entrance. My breath fogged up in the cold, each exhale heavy with dread as I walked toward the door. Inside, the facility was deathly silent, the only sound my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. I half expected to see the bloodstains still smeared along the corridor, the whispers still lingering in the air, but everything was clean, unnaturally so. It was like the place had been scrubbed down, every trace of what I'd seen erased. The silence felt heavier, thicker, almost tangible. My phone buzzed, the sudden noise jarring me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, hoping against hope that it was John. But it wasn't. It was another unknown number, and this time there was no distorted voice, no cryptic message. Just one simple text. Room 3. My hands felt numb as I pocketed my phone, the words flashing in my mind like a warning, or maybe a command. I knew the layout now, knew the way to room 3 without even thinking. Each step felt heavier than the last as I walked down the corridor, past the empty rooms, my eyes fixed on that familiar door. When I reached it, I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air around me was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel that strange pressure again, like I was being watched, judged. The symbol on my wrist burned, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, urging me forward. I opened the door. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a faint glow in the centre. And as my eyes adjusted, I realised what I was looking at. It was the drain. The same one I'd scrubbed the night before, now surrounded by symbols etched into the floor, deeper and darker than before, each line precise, intentional. The air was thick with the stench of rot and iron, a smell that made my stomach twist, the scent clinging to my throat like a poison. Then I noticed something else. In the shadows, lining the walls, were figures, dozens of them, motionless, silent, their faces obscured by the darkness. They were watching me, their heads tilted slightly like they were waiting for something. A voice echoed through the room, low and hollow, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You are the cleaner. Finish the job." The words chilled me to my core, the same tone as the voice on the phone. But now it seemed deeper, older, like something ancient was speaking through it. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to run out of that room and never look back. But my body wouldn't listen. My hands moved on their own, reaching into my bag, pulling out my cleaning supplies, setting them down in front of the drain. The blood started seeping up from the drain, again, thick and dark, pooling around my feet, soaking into the floor. I scrubbed, my hands moving mechanically, my mind screaming in protest. But I couldn't stop. My body felt like it was no longer mine, like I was a puppet being controlled by some invisible force. As I scrubbed, the figures watched, silent and still, their faces hidden in the shadows. I could feel their eyes on me, their presence pressing down on me, suffocating. And with each stroke of the brush, I felt something else, something shifting inside me, like I was losing pieces of myself, leaving them behind in that blood. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing in time with my heartbeat, each line burning into my mind. The whispers started again, louder this time, filling my head with words I couldn't understand, voices that sounded both human and inhuman, ancient and angry. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the blood receded, disappearing back into the drain, leaving the floor spotless. The figures in the shadows stepped forward, their faces still hidden, their bodies draped in long, dark robes that seemed to absorb the light. One of them reached out, holding something in its hand. It was a small, blood-red vial, the glass shimmering in the dim light. The figure held it out to me, waiting. "Take it," the voice commanded, echoing through my mind. I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming to run, but my hand moved on its own, reaching out, fingers closing around the vial. It was cold, impossibly so, the chill seeping into my skin, filling me with a sense of dread that went beyond fear, a feeling of inevitability, like I'd just sealed my fate. The figures stepped back, disappearing into the shadows one by one, until I was alone in the room, the vial clutched in my hand, the symbol on my wrist burning brighter than ever. My phone buzzed again, the sudden noise breaking the silence. It was another text. "Now, you belong to us." I didn't wait. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, through the empty corridors, my mind numb, my heart pounding. The air felt thick, like it was trying to pull me back, but I forced myself forward, refusing to look back, refusing to think about what I'd just seen, what I'd just done. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far away from that place as possible. But as I drove, the symbol on my wrist continued to burn, a constant, searing reminder that no matter how far I went, I would never truly escape. I had taken something that didn't belong to me, and now I was theirs. I don't know how long I drove. The world around me blurred into an endless stream of streetlights and shadows, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. My hands were locked on the wheel, the vial still clenched tightly in my right hand, its coldness leaching into my skin, as if it were alive, pulsating with its own faint heartbeat. Eventually, exhaustion won. My vision blurred, the lines on the road wavering, twisting, until I had to pull over to keep from driving straight into the ditch. I slumped back in my seat, closing my eyes, breathing heavily. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on me, filling my lungs with a weight that made it impossible to breathe deeply. The symbol on my wrist was still there, angry and raw. I could feel it burning, a dull, insistent pain that throbbed with each beat of my heart, like it was sinking deeper into my skin, anchoring itself to me. I thought about ditching the vial, throwing it out the window, But something deep inside told me that would only make things worse. Whatever was happening, whatever I had taken, it was a part of me now. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me back to the present. The screen glowed in the darkness, displaying yet another unknown number. I wanted to ignore it, but my thumb moved on its own, opening the message. "You can't run." I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, my chest tight with a sick mix of fear and frustration. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping I could block out the world, just for a second. And then, there was a knock on my window. I froze, my heart seizing. Slowly, I lifted my head, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as I forced myself to look out the window. A face stared back at me. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to bore straight into me, reading every thought, every fear. Its lips were thin, barely a line, its expression as still and blank as a corpse. It was the same face I'd seen in the mirror, the same face that had watched me from the shadows in that cursed facility. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. I could feel its gaze piercing me, cold and unfeeling, a reminder that I was being hunted, claimed. I reached for the ignition, my fingers trembling, desperate to drive, to get away from that lifeless face. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The car stayed silent, dead, like everything else around me had gone still, waiting. The figure raised one skeletal hand, tapping a single, bony finger against the glass. The sound was soft but insistent, each tap sending a shockwave of fear through me, the rhythm matching the steady pulse of the symbol on my wrist. I wanted to scream, to slam my fist against the window, but I was paralyzed, trapped by that gaze. Then, without a sound, the figure leaned forward, its lips parting slightly, just enough for me to hear the faintest whisper. "Finish what you started." The words echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts, driving out any semblance of rationality. It wasn't a request. It was an order, a command woven deep into my bones. I didn't know what it meant, didn't know what I was supposed to finish, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't resist. The figure pulled back, fading into the shadows as silently as it had appeared. I sat there, trembling, until the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, turning the darkness into a hazy, muted grey. It was only then that the car finally started, the engine sputtering to life as if it had never stopped. I drove home in silence, the vial still clutched in my hand, the symbol on my wrist burning like a brand. Back in my apartment, I locked the door, sliding down onto the floor, staring at the vial. It was small, almost unremarkable, but the longer I looked at it, the more I felt its pull. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I had to figure out what this thing was, what it meant. The whispers I'd heard, the symbols, the faces, they were all connected, part of some twisted design that I'd somehow become entangled in. I spent hours searching online, digging through pages and pages of cryptic websites, forums hidden deep within the web. Each thread I followed led me deeper into a dark, tangled web of symbols, cults, and rituals I could barely comprehend. It was like sifting through fragments of a nightmare, glimpses of ancient practices that had been buried and forgotten for good reason. Finally, I found something. A mention of a ritual performed by a secretive group known only as the Keepers. According to the scraps of information I could find, the Keepers were an ancient cult, their purpose shrouded in secrecy, dedicated to maintaining a balance between realms, or dimensions, or something else entirely. The details were scarce, but one thing was clear. They didn't just perform rituals. They bound people to them, like vessels, tools to carry out their will. The ritual required a mark and an offering, a symbol branded onto flesh, and a vial of blood to bind the spirit of the vessel to the keepers. And once marked, the vessel belonged to them, body and soul, forever. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my hands clenching around the vial. The symbol on my wrist wasn't just a brand. It was a seal, a mark that had tied me to something far beyond my understanding, something dark and insidious. I was a vessel now, bound to finish whatever twisted ritual I'd stumbled into, whether I wanted to or not. My phone buzzed again, and I didn't even need to look to know it was another message from that same unknown number. Come to us. I tried to ignore it, tried to shove the phone away, but the words wouldn't leave my mind. I could feel the symbol on my wrist, pulsing, burning, urging me to obey. I was no longer in control. I was just a puppet, a marionette with strings I couldn't see, strings held by hands that existed beyond my reality. I don't know what time it was when I finally gave in, when I stood up and let my feet carry me out of my apartment, back to my car, back to that cursed facility. The city felt empty, hollow, as if the entire world had pulled away, leaving me alone to face whatever awaited. When I arrived, the gate was already open, waiting. I walked down the familiar path, through the silent hallways, until I reached room 3. This time, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dimly lit space, the floor covered in symbols and markings I recognized now. Seals, wards, meant to bind and control. In the center of the room was a circle, marked with thick, dark lines, surrounded by candles that flickered with an unnatural red flame. And in the middle of the circle was an altar, a rough stone slab covered in dark stains, the air around it thick with the stench of rot and decay. I approached the altar, the vial in my hand growing heavier with each step. I could feel the weight of eyes on me, the figures watching from the shadows, waiting for me to finish what they had started. Without thinking, I placed the vial on the altar, my fingers trembling as I stepped back. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that pressed down on me, filling my lungs with a sense of finality, of inevitability. The candles flickered, the flames growing brighter, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers began again, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the symbol on my wrist. I felt the mark burning, searing into my skin, binding me to the circle, to the ritual, to the keepers. And then, out of the darkness, the figure appeared. It was the same figure I'd seen before, its hollow eyes staring into me, its face blank, expressionless, as if it were nothing more than a mask. It reached out one hand, its fingers long and skeletal, resting on the vial. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the figure spoke, its voice filling the room, low and hollow. "The vessel is bound. The keeper is awake." The words filled me with a cold dread, an understanding that went beyond words. I wasn't just a vessel. I was a conduit, a bridge between worlds, a tool for something ancient and unspeakable. The figure turned, fading back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the room, the mark on my wrist burning brighter than ever, a constant reminder of my new purpose. I felt it then, a presence stirring inside me, something dark and cold, whispering promises I couldn't understand, urges I couldn't resist. I staggered out of the facility, my mind numb, my soul heavy, knowing that I would never be free. I belonged to them now, bound to a purpose I would never fully understand, an eternity of servitude stretching before me, an existence dedicated to the will of the keepers. And as I drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel, the whispers began again, filling my mind, guiding my thoughts. leading me toward my first task, the first of many. I didn't know where they would take me or what they would make me do, but I knew one thing for certain: I would never be alone again. I was hired as a private chef for an elite party in the middle of nowhere. I'm starting to think the guests aren't human. So, I'm a chef. Not a fancy, top-of-the-line one who works in Michelin-starred restaurants or anything like that, but a pretty good one nonetheless. Mostly, I freelance for private gigs, like dinner parties, weddings, that sort of thing. You know, people who want something a bit more personal than catering, but don't want to spend thousands. It's a good job, pays well. I meet interesting people and it allows me to do what I love. But about 2 weeks ago, I got offered a gig that's, well, it's the kind of thing that sounds great at first, but ends up being something you wish you could forget. That's why I'm writing this. I'd been hired by this guy who I'll call Mr. Black. That's literally how he introduced himself on the phone. Kinda cliche, right? He found me through my website, said he'd heard good things. He explained he was organising a party for some high-profile clients and needed someone reliable, discreet, and most importantly, non-judgmental. That should have been my first red flag. I've done a few high-end events before, so I knew what he meant by non-judgmental. Usually it means the guests will be snobby, maybe a bit rude, or there will be more expensive wine than food. But the money he was offering was unreal. To be honest, I was so taken aback by the amount that I didn't think twice. A couple of $1,000s for a single weekend? I'd be insane not to take it. I said yes and gave him my list of ingredients and equipment I'd need, assuming it was some ritzy, low-key house party. Mr. Black assured me everything would be provided. I just had to bring my skills and follow the instructions. All right, no big deal, I thought. I've worked in all kinds of places, and I've handled my fair share of eccentric requests. Little did I know, I had no idea what I was in for. The day came, and I received a black car at my door, just like Mr. Black had arranged. I'll admit, it was pretty cool. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows, like something out of a spy movie. The driver didn't say a word. He just nodded when I got in, then started driving. After a while, I noticed we were heading way out of the city, taking smaller roads that wound through thick forest. We passed fewer and fewer houses until finally, there was just endless green on either side. I asked the driver where we were going, but he just looked at me in the rearview mirror with this blank expression. At that point, I realised I had no idea where I was. The cell reception dropped completely after about an hour. I'd been in deep forests before for events, but this felt different, like this place didn't want to be found. After what felt like forever, we pulled up to this enormous, crumbling mansion. It was in the middle of nowhere, hidden by tall trees and thick underbrush. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling off, and the windows were dark and dusty. My first thought was, this cannot be where the party's at. I was about to ask the driver if he was sure we were in the right place, but he'd already stepped out and was unloading my stuff from the trunk. He didn't say a word. He just handed me my bags and got back in the car, leaving me standing there in front of this looming, decaying building. I considered calling Mr. Black to double check, but I remembered I had no reception. So I shrugged it off, figuring maybe it was some kind of vintage aesthetic thing the guests were into. Rich people can be weird, right? Plus, I couldn't exactly call a ride back. With no other options, I walked up to the massive rusted iron door and knocked. Nothing. Just silence, except for the faint sound of leaves rustling in the wind. After a few minutes, the door creaked open on its own, like it had been pushed from the inside, though there was no one in sight. I figured someone must have opened it and slipped away, so I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello? Mr. Black?" The entrance hall was dark and cold, like stepping into a tomb. There was this strange smell, something earthy and metallic, like wet soil mixed with rusted metal. I couldn't see much in the dim light, just vague shapes of antique furniture covered with dusty sheets. I walked further in, hoping to find a light switch or someone to tell me where to go. That's when I noticed the paintings on the walls. They were weird. Each painting looked like a distorted, almost caricatured portrait of someone. But their faces were all wrong. The features were exaggerated, like eyes that were way too big, smiles that were stretched too wide, and skin that looked grey and sickly. Their eyes, though, they almost looked alive. I know that sounds insane, but when I walked past them, I felt like they were watching me, tracking my every step. Finally, a tall, thin man appeared at the end of the hall, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1800s. He had a slight smirk on his face, but his eyes were completely blank, like he was looking right through me. "Ah, you must be the chef," he said, voice smooth and almost creepy, like he was playing a part in a movie. He extended his hand, but I didn't take it. Something about him put me on edge immediately. "Yeah, I'm here for Mr. Black's party," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. "I was told everything would be set up for me." "Oh, yes," he replied, still smirking. "Follow me to the kitchen. We've prepared everything just as Mr. Black instructed." I followed him down a series of twisting hallways. The mansion seemed to go on forever, with corridor after corridor, each one lined with those same eerie portraits. The smell grew stronger as we went deeper, almost choking me. When we finally arrived in the kitchen, I was shocked. It was massive, filled with high-end equipment that looked totally out of place in the otherwise decrepit mansion. The man smiled again. "Mr. Black's guests have very specific tastes," he said, almost like he was in on some joke I didn't understand. Before I could ask anything, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the silence. I stood there, taking it all in, trying to shake the feeling that something was very wrong here. Just then, I noticed a stack of handwritten recipes on the counter, each one more bizarre than the last. They were all for dishes I'd never heard of, with ingredients I couldn't even identify. There were instructions like, "Marinate for 7 hours under a new moon," and "Do not taste until the midnight bell tolls." I don't know why, but I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't like any party prep I'd done before. But the worst part? At the top of the list was a note in handwriting that didn't look like Mr. Black's at all. It simply said, "Once you start cooking, they will come. Do not look them in the eye." All right, so I'm standing there in this strange, outdated kitchen, holding a bunch of recipes that look like they came from some kind of medieval cookbook. I mean, I've worked with odd ingredients before. Exotic spices, rare mushrooms, stuff like that. But these were on a whole new level. Essence of nightshade, fermented marrow broth, and even something labelled petrified flesh were on the list. I was starting to wonder if this was all some sort of prank, like a hazing for new chefs or something. But the kitchen was immaculate, stocked with what looked like thousands of dollars worth of equipment and supplies. Every surface was spotless, and every knife and spoon was arranged with the kind of precision you only see in professional kitchens or crime scenes. The weirdness was real. This wasn't just someone's idea of a joke. Still, the paycheck I was promised danced around in my head and I told myself I could handle a bit of creepy eccentricity for a night if it meant cashing out big. I decided to start on the first dish, hoping it would ease me into this whole ordeal. The recipe card simply called it the appetizer, but the instructions made my skin crawl. It required me to heat a strange, dark oil until it started to smoke, then add essence of shadows. I have no idea what essence of shadows was supposed to be, but next to the instruction, there was a small bottle filled with an inky liquid that seemed to absorb light. I uncorked it, and the smell hit me immediately. It was sharp and bitter, almost like burnt metal mixed with something rotten. I followed the recipe though, pouring a small amount into the pan. As soon as it hit the heat, the liquid hissed and sent up thick, black smoke that filled the kitchen with that awful, metallic stench. I had to step back, covering my nose and mouth with my sleeve. This was not cooking. This was alchemy, or witchcraft, or something. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I kept telling myself I'd get through it. As I stirred the contents, I became aware of a strange rhythmic sound, like soft footsteps, coming from somewhere down the hall. I stopped listening, but the sound stopped too. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The eerie quiet of the place was getting to me, I thought. I shook it off and kept cooking, focusing on the next step, adding a dusting of lunar ash, which was literally a fine grey powder in a small vial labelled with the same words, and setting it to simmer. As I turned away to grab another ingredient, I heard it, a whisper. It was so soft, so faint, that at first I thought it was the wind. But there it was again, unmistakable. A low, raspy voice murmuring just outside the door to the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like chanting. My heart pounded as I inched closer to the door, trying to listen. But when I got close, it went dead silent. I knew it wasn't just in my head. That was real. Someone, or something, was right outside the kitchen, and they knew I was here. A part of me wanted to throw down my apron and just leave, but another part, a much bigger, curious part, wanted to see this through. I had already started cooking after all, and something about this whole setup made me feel like backing out wasn't really an option anymore. Besides, where would I even go? I was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell reception and no way of calling for a ride. So I told myself I'd just finish the appetizer and see if anyone would show up to eat it. At least then I'd know if I was actually cooking for guests or if this was some elaborate prank. When I turned back to the stove, I froze. Standing just a few feet away, right on the edge of the kitchen's dim light, was a figure. Tall and unnaturally thin. They were draped in a long, black cloak that covered everything but their face. Or, well, what I thought was their face. I couldn't make out any features, just the suggestion of hollow eyes staring straight at me from beneath a hood. And those eyes, they were like two empty pits. No light, no soul, just pure darkness. I tried to remember Mr. Black's note, "Do not look them in the eye." So, I quickly looked down at my hands, trying to act like I hadn't seen anything. My heart was racing, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my neck. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel them watching me, feel the coldness radiating from them like a wave. After what felt like forever, they stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. I stood there, frozen, clutching the edge of the counter to keep myself steady. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing. I wasn't alone. Something was in this house with me. Multiple somethings, if the note was anything to go by. I finished the appetizer, trying my best to ignore the feeling of unseen eyes boring into my back. As soon as I plated it, I heard the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps again. This time, they were closer, right outside the kitchen door. I waited, not daring to breathe, as the door creaked open, just a sliver. Through the crack, I caught a glimpse of another figure, shorter than the first, with a hunched posture and a face that was wrong. It was as if someone had taken a human face and stretched it in all the wrong places. The skin was too tight, the mouth too wide, and the eyes too large, almost like a doll's eyes, glassy and expressionless. They stared at me with a look that I can only describe as hungry. And as soon as they saw the appetizer on the counter, they shuffled inside, reaching out with these long, spindly fingers. I stepped back as they picked up the plate, sniffing it before taking a slow, deliberate bite. The sound they made as they chewed was wet and unnatural, almost like they were gnashing their teeth together with every bite. They finished the food in seconds, licking the plate clean with a long greyish tongue that flicked out like a snake's. Then, without even looking at me, they turned and shuffled out of the kitchen, leaving me alone again. The smell of the food they'd eaten lingered in the air, mingling with that earthy, metallic stench that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move on to the next dish on the list. This one was even stranger, an entree that called for a heart of darkness and blackened marrow, both of which were conveniently laid out on the counter. The heart was unlike anything I'd ever seen, pitch black, with veins that pulsed faintly as though it were still alive. I told myself it was just a rare cut of meat, that maybe it had been soaked in some kind of dye, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. This was no ordinary ingredient. As I prepared it, I heard more footsteps outside, heavier this time. They stopped right in front of the door, and then, just as I thought they might come in, I heard that chanting again. Louder this time, but still muffled, like a dozen voices whispering in unison. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded ancient, almost primal, like some language that had been forgotten by the world. The chanting grew louder as I finished the dish, filling the room with a strange, oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. When I finally plated the entree, the chanting stopped. Silence fell over the house, so thick and complete that it felt like a weight pressing down on me. I waited, staring at the door, half expecting another figure to appear and take the food. But this time, no one came. Instead, I heard the sound of soft scratching coming from the far corner of the kitchen. I turned slowly, feeling my skin prickle with fear, and saw a figure crouching there, hidden in the shadows. They were smaller than the others, almost childlike, with limbs that were too long and bent at odd angles. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and they had a mouth filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. They watched me with unblinking, hungry eyes, their gaze never leaving me as they licked their lips. The note flashed in my mind again. Do not look them in the eye. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the counter as I backed out of the kitchen, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the hallway, I glanced back one last time, just to make sure I wasn't being followed, but the kitchen was empty, and the shadows had swallowed the crouching figure whole. I knew then that I was in way over my head. This wasn't just a strange party or an eccentric client. There was something wrong here, something inhuman, and I had no idea how to get out. I stood in the hallway just outside the kitchen, gripping the wall to steady myself, my mind racing. The reality of my situation was finally sinking in. There was no way I was just cooking for eccentric rich folks. No, this was something darker, something ancient, and I had walked right into it for the promise of a fat paycheck. I could still hear the faint echoes of the chanting, the way it seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the mansion, like the building itself was breathing. I'd been trying to chalk it all up to nerves, to unfamiliar surroundings, but that excuse was gone. I knew I wasn't alone in this place. Worse, I knew that whatever, or whoever, I was cooking for was far from human. With no idea how to escape, I decided to press on, hoping that if I did my job and stayed invisible, I'd make it out. The next dish on the list was labelled main course with no further description. Just like the last ones though, it had a set of unsettling ingredients. Blood root puree, ashbone dust, and eyes of the hollow. My stomach churned, but there they were, all set out on the counter, each ingredient in a pristine glass jar. I opened the jar of eyes of the hollow and froze. Inside were 3 perfectly preserved eyeballs, large and glossy, with irises that were a murky shade of grey, as though the colour had been drained from them. They almost looked like human eyes, but something was wrong about them. The pupils were too small, almost pinpricks, and each one seemed to stare back at me with an awareness that sent chills down my spine. With no other choice, I began preparing the dish, following the instructions exactly. As I blended the bloodroot puree, the thick red liquid oozed down the sides of the bowl like something alive. It felt like the kitchen was getting colder, the air dense and damp, almost suffocating. And that's when I heard it again. The footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I didn't dare look up, didn't dare acknowledge it. I kept my eyes down, focused on my work, heart pounding. I could see a shadow creeping along the floor, stretching toward me like a long, spindly hand, reaching out. I forced myself to keep moving, chopping, blending, measuring, all while that shadow loomed closer. I could almost feel it, like an icy weight pressing down on my shoulders, watching me. Just as I finished plating, the shadow receded, retreating into the hallway. I dared a glance at the doorway, but it was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The last thing I wanted was to see what was lurking in that darkness. I carefully placed the main course on the counter, half expecting one of those creatures to shuffle in and take it like before. But this time, no one appeared. I waited, the silence stretching on, until the only sound I could hear was the faint hum of the kitchen appliances. Then, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. And as the light settled, I noticed something new on the countertop. A small envelope, black as coal, with my name written on it in delicate, spidery handwriting. With shaking hands, I picked it up and opened it, pulling out a single slip of paper. The note inside was short, and every word felt like a warning. You have one last course to prepare. When it is done, bring it to the dining hall. Do not look at the guests. Do not speak. And whatever you do, do not try to leave. I stared at the note, my heart thudding. They knew I'd been thinking about escape, that I'd been searching the hallways with my eyes, looking for a door, a window, anything that might lead outside. Somehow they knew. With a sinking feeling, I turned back to the recipe cards. The last dish was labelled Final Offering. The instructions were precise but vague, like they'd been written in a code only I was meant to understand. A pinch of dusk salt, it read, a spoonful of midnight oil, and the heart of the chef. I blinked, hoping I'd read it wrong. The heart of the chef. I looked at the instructions again, and no, there was no mistake. I didn't know what it meant. Was it literal, or just some symbolic flourish? But after everything I'd seen tonight, I wasn't about to take any chances. I began preparing the dish, my hands trembling as I moved through each step. The ingredients seemed to throb with energy, each one dark and pulsing, filling the air with that metallic stench. I mixed the dusk salt with the midnight oil, the thick black liquid swirling like smoke, and poured it over what I assumed was supposed to be the heart. It was a strange, dark red organ, not quite like anything I'd ever seen before. I tried to tell myself it was just another exotic cut of meat, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something much worse. As I placed the dish on a silver platter, I felt a shift in the air. The chanting started again, louder this time, echoing through the walls and down the dark hallways. It sounded as if it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Shadows danced along the walls, writhing and shifting as though they were alive. The door to the kitchen swung open on its own, revealing a long hallway that led deeper into the mansion. I'd been avoiding that direction all night, but now it seemed like I had no choice. I picked up the platter, the weight of it almost unbearable, and started down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The mansion seemed to breathe around me, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. I passed rooms filled with strange artifacts, old mirrors that reflected nothing, statues with blank faces, and shelves lined with jars of murky liquid. In one room, I saw a large, ornate clock with hands that spun backward, each tick louder than the last. I walked faster, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Finally, I reached the dining hall. The doors were massive, carved with intricate symbols that I didn't recognize, but they felt ancient, almost sacred. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room was vast, with a long, dark table stretching from one end to the other. Candles flickered along its length, casting an eerie, wavering light. Around the table sat figures cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden. I couldn't see their features clearly, but I could feel their eyes on me, each gaze heavy and hungry, like they were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I remembered the note. Do not look at the guests. Do not speak. I kept my eyes down as I walked to the head of the table, where a single empty plate waited. My footsteps seemed to echo louder with each step, like the house itself was amplifying the sound. I placed the final dish on the plate, careful to keep my gaze averted from the guests. As soon as the dish was set, I heard a low murmur ripple through the room, like a sound of approval. The chanting began again, low and guttural, filling the air with a sense of dark anticipation. I stepped back, keeping my head down, resisting the urge to run. I didn't know what would happen if I broke the rules, but I wasn't about to find out. Then I felt it, a hand, cold and bony, resting on my shoulder. I tensed, my heart pounding as the chanting grew louder, almost deafening. The hand gripped my shoulder, pulling me closer to the table, and a voice, low and ancient, dripping with malice, whispered in my ear, "Stay." My blood ran cold. The word wasn't a request, it was a command. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on me. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the voices blending together into a dark, twisted harmony. My head was spinning, and I could feel my grip on reality slipping. The air grew thick, heavy, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in on me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the chanting stopped. Silence fell over the dining hall, so complete that it felt like the world had ended. The hand released my shoulder, and I dared to open my eyes. The dining hall was empty. The guests, the table, the candles, everything was gone. I was standing alone in a dark, empty room, with no sign that anyone had ever been there. The only thing left was the final dish, still sitting on the plate at the head of the table, untouched. My hands were shaking as I backed out of the room, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever had just happened. I turned and sprinted down the hallway, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I ran past the kitchen, past the strange rooms, past the eerie portraits, until I finally found a door that led outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled out onto the lawn, gasping for breath. The mansion loomed behind me, dark and silent, as though it had swallowed its secrets whole. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the property, where a single black car was waiting. The driver stood beside it, expressionless, as though he'd been expecting me all along. He didn't say a word as I climbed into the car, and within moments, we were driving away from the mansion, leaving that dark, twisted place far behind. I tried to ask him what had happened, who or what the guests were, but he just looked at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and empty. When I got back home, I found an envelope waiting on my doorstep. Inside was my payment, more than what I'd been promised. But there was also a note scrawled in the same spidery handwriting as before. "You are marked now. We will be watching. We will be waiting." I never went back to that mansion. I never took another private gig after that. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. After that night, life didn't exactly go back to normal. I tried to tell myself it was just a job gone wrong, a bizarre, surreal experience that I could shrug off eventually. I threw the envelope with the payment in the bottom drawer of my dresser, hoping that burying it would help me forget. But the sense of dread didn't fade. If anything, it only grew stronger. It started with small things. Shadows that lingered a bit too long in the corners of my apartment. Odd noises in the middle of the night. At first I wrote it off as paranoia, a lingering effect of whatever hellish experience I'd gone through at that mansion. But then, one evening as I was cleaning up from dinner, I caught a glimpse of something in the window over the sink. It was faint, but unmistakable. A pair of eyes, staring right at me from the other side of the glass. The eyes were hollow, empty, like those of the guests at the mansion. They were wide, unblinking, and far too close, pressed against the window as though whoever, or whatever they belonged to, was leaning against the glass. I froze, my hand clenched around the dish towel, unable to look away. Just as I was about to scream, the eyes vanished, dissolving into the darkness. I stumbled back, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no way for anyone to be standing outside my window. And yet, those eyes had been there, watching me. After that, the visits became more frequent. Every night, at exactly midnight, I'd hear a soft, shuffling sound outside my apartment door. It was faint, like something was dragging across the floor. A slow, deliberate scraping that made my skin crawl. I'd lie in bed, clutching the covers, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, the footsteps would stop right outside my door, and a shadow would appear in the crack of light beneath it, unmoving. One night, I worked up the courage to look through the peephole. I held my breath, expecting to see an empty hallway. Instead, I saw a figure standing right outside my door, staring back at me. They were draped in that same dark cloak I'd seen in the mansion, their face shrouded in shadow. But their eyes, I could see their eyes, hollow and unblinking, just inches away from the peephole. They stayed there for what felt like hours, never moving, never blinking, just watching. When they finally disappeared, I staggered back, unable to shake the feeling that they had seen straight into my soul. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those hollow, empty faces staring at me. Then the notes started appearing. The first one showed up in my mailbox a few days later, written on black paper with that same spidery handwriting. I could barely bring myself to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was simple. We see you. That alone was enough to send me spiraling. I stopped opening my mail after that. Bills, junk mail, letters from friends. I ignored it all, afraid of what I might find. But the notes kept coming. They'd show up slipped under my door, taped to my bathroom mirror, even tucked inside my coat pockets. Every time, it was the same message. We see you. It didn't take long for the paranoia to take over completely. I started avoiding mirrors, terrified that I might catch a glimpse of one of them behind me. I'd feel eyes on me while walking down the street, watching me from the shadows, between buildings, from alleyways, from the reflection in store windows. I'd glance over my shoulder constantly, but I never caught anyone or anything following me. It was as if they were always there, just out of sight, lurking in the edges of my vision. Then came the whispers. I was lying in bed one night, staring up at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes, when I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper coming from right beside me. I bolted upright, but my room was empty. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, hoping I'd just imagined it. But then, the whisper came again, closer this time, as though someone was leaning over me. You belong to us now. The voice was low, almost a hiss, and it sent an icy shiver down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the mind, that I was just sleep deprived, but the words echoed in my head long after the whisper had faded. I spent the rest of the night curled up in the corner of my room, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for the dawn. The next day, I went to see a friend of mine, someone who's big into paranormal stuff, ghosts, spirits, urban legends. I figured if anyone could make sense of what was happening to me, it'd be her. She listened patiently as I told her everything. The mansion, the guests, the chanting, the whispers. She didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, she looked at me with this expression of deep concern, almost fear. You said you took a job with no information, went to a place you couldn't find again if you tried, and you accepted payment without understanding the cost, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You opened a door, and now they're in. They won't leave. Who won't leave? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. She hesitated before answering, as if she didn't want to say it aloud. They're watchers, beings from another realm, another plane of existence. They're ancient and dangerous, and once they set their sights on someone, they never stop. They feed on fear, on isolation. They slip between worlds, observing, waiting, hungry. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but she wasn't done. They're drawn to people who are curious, who meddle in things they shouldn't. You walked into their domain and served them, became part of their ritual. They see you as one of them now. As theirs, I left her apartment, feeling more terrified and helpless than ever. No amount of sage, salt, or incantations could protect me from them, she'd warned me. Once they'd marked someone, there was no escaping it. The best I could do was keep my head down, pretend I didn't notice them, and hope they'd lose interest. But even she didn't sound convinced. That night, I did my best to follow her advice. I kept all the lights on, double-checked the locks, and climbed into bed, telling myself to ignore any sounds I might hear. I shut my eyes, hoping against hope that sleep would come. But then, right around midnight, I heard it again. That slow, deliberate scratching outside my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the sheets, repeating to myself that it wasn't real, that I was imagining it. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like something was clawing at the wood, desperate to get in. And then, the handle turned. My heart stopped as I heard the creak of the door opening. I lay completely still, holding my breath, hoping whoever, or whatever, had come inside wouldn't notice me. I could hear it moving through my apartment, footsteps soft and shuffling, like it was taking its time, savouring each step. I dared to open my eyes just a sliver, and saw a dark shadow standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, hollow and empty, like pits into some endless darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring, as though waiting for me to acknowledge it. I kept my eyes shut tight, my heart racing, praying it would go away. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and disappeared into the hallway, its footsteps fading into silence. I didn't sleep that night, or any night after. I spent the next few days jumping at every shadow, every creak of the floor, convinced they were still there, waiting, watching. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a bag, grabbed the cash from the bottom drawer, and left, not caring where I was going as long as it was far away from there. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, figuring I'd lay low until I figured out my next move. But that first night in the motel, just as I was drifting off, I heard the scratching again. The scratching was unmistakable, faint at first, just a soft scraping sound against the motel room door. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. I'd left everything behind, my apartment, my routine, even my own name if it would keep me safe, and yet, here they were, those silent, unseen watchers. The motel room was small, and the door was only a few feet away from the bed. I could practically feel the cold radiating from the other side, creeping through the thin walls like icy fingers. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there knew I was close, could sense my fear through the flimsy wood. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly, trying to keep my nerves in check. But the scratching didn't stop. It went on, rhythmic and relentless, like nails scraping over the surface of my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I lay there waiting, listening. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd gone. But then from somewhere beyond the door I heard it. A low guttural whisper, so faint it was barely more than a breath. "You belong to us." My pulse quickened, and I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. It was that same voice, that same ancient hollow whisper I'd heard the first night in my apartment. They'd found me, even miles from home, hiding in this empty motel room. They'd found me. I'd had enough. Without even stopping to think, I grabbed my bag and stumbled out of bed, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the door. I had to get out, had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of them. I didn't care if I looked like a lunatic, running from something no one else could see. I couldn't stay there, trapped with them right outside the door. As I opened the door, the hallway was empty. No shadowy figures, no whispers, just the dim, flickering lights casting strange patterns on the faded wallpaper. I took a few cautious steps, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting to see one of them materializing out of thin air behind me. I made it down the hall, through the empty lobby, and out into the cold night air. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. I walked for hours, my feet aching, my mind numb. The streets were deserted, the town a ghost town in the early hours of the morning. I wandered aimlessly, hoping that if I put enough distance between myself and the motel, I'd be safe. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Distance didn't matter to them. At some point, I found myself at the edge of the forest that bordered the town. The trees were tall and dense, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the night sky. I knew it wasn't a good idea to go into the woods, especially in the dead of night. But something compelled me, pulling me forward. It was as if the forest itself was calling to me, offering a temporary refuge from the relentless pursuit of those watchers. I stepped into the darkness, the shadows closing in around me. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the moonlight, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I walked deeper into the forest, letting the silence swallow me, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could lose them in the dark. But as I moved through the trees, I realized I wasn't alone. I could feel them, the watchers somewhere just out of sight, slipping between the shadows, their hollow eyes tracking my every step. I could sense them, moving in perfect silence, blending into the night. And then the whispers started again. "You belong to us." The words seemed to echo through the trees, carried on the wind, surrounding me from all sides. I broke into a run, branches scratching at my arms and face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were closing in, tightening their hold on me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I stumbled into a clearing, and there, in the centre, was something that stopped me cold. It was a large stone altar, ancient and weathered, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The sight of it sent a wave of dread crashing over me, but I couldn't look away. I knew somehow that this altar was connected to them, that it was a part of whatever dark ritual I'd been swept into. I stepped closer, drawn by some invisible force, unable to resist. As I approached, I saw something resting on the altar, a small black envelope with my name written on it in that same spidery handwriting. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, the paper cold and damp against my fingers. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what message they had left for me, but I couldn't stop myself. I unfolded the note, the words etched into the paper as if they'd been carved there. "Your journey is complete. Welcome home." The world seemed to tilt around me, and I stumbled back, my vision blurring. I could feel the forest closing in, the trees pressing closer, the shadows growing darker. The whispers filled my mind, a constant, droning chant that drowned out everything else. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the shadows one by one, surrounding the clearing. Each one was draped in dark cloaks, their faces obscured, but I could feel their eyes on me, empty and hollow, waiting. The watchers. They'd followed me, chased me through every dark corner, every hiding place, and now they had me. I turned to run, but the shadows were everywhere, closing in, trapping me in the clearing. The figures moved silently, circling me, their hollow eyes unblinking. I backed up against the altar, clutching the note, my mind racing with panic. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The watchers surrounded me, their faces mere inches from mine, their whispers filling the air. And then I felt it. A cold hand resting on my shoulder, pressing down with a grip that felt like iron. I didn't dare turn to see who, or what, was behind me. But I could feel their presence, towering over me, their hollow eyes boring into me. A voice, low and ancient, spoke into my ear. "Your service is accepted." My vision blurred, and the world began to dissolve around me. The shadows closed in, swallowing everything. The trees, the clearing, the watchers. I felt myself slipping away, my body growing numb, my mind clouded with darkness. The last thing I saw was the altar, the ancient symbols glowing faintly as the shadows claimed me. When I came to, I was standing outside the old mansion, the one where it had all begun. The night was silent, the air thick with that familiar metallic smell. I didn't remember how I'd gotten there, but I knew deep down that I'd never left. I'd been pulled back, drawn into their world, bound to them. The mansion door creaked open, and I stepped inside, my movements slow and mechanical, like I was no longer in control of my own body. The house was dark and empty, just as it had been the night of the party, but now it felt different. It felt familiar, like I belonged there. I walked down the hall, past the eerie portraits, past the twisting shadows, until I reached the dining hall. The table was set, each place carefully arranged, but the chairs were empty. I took my place at the head of the table, the notes still clutched in my hand. One by one, the figures appeared, taking their seats, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I looked around, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me, as if I'd finally found my place among them. The Watchers had marked me, claimed me. I was theirs now, part of their eternal ritual. And as I looked into their empty, soulless eyes, I felt something stir within me. A dark understanding, a twisted sense of purpose. The chanting began, low and rhythmic, filling the room with a haunting, unholy melody. I joined them, the words flowing from my lips like a prayer, ancient and unfamiliar. The shadows closed in, wrapping around us like a shroud, binding me to them forever. In the depths of the night, in the hollow silence of the mansion, I became one of them.